Hey guys, so today we're joined by Glen Goodman, author of The Crypto Trader, who's going to talk to us about crypto trading as well as debunk a few myths along the way. Glen, who you may or may not recognise, was formerly a business correspondent for both the BBC and ITV News and has since flipped the script. From interviewing big names such as David Cameron and Boris Johnson as a journalist, Glen is now the interviewee. Since famously turning £3,000 into 100,000 by betting there would be a crash in 2008, and developing a natural flair for financial markets trading, Glen has been interviewed about cryptocurrency and other business topics by the BBC, Radio, Al Jazeera, LBC, The Guardian, The Independent and Forbes. He is also a cryptocurrency contributor to the London School of Economics. How about that? Glen, welcome.
Hi, Rob.
Hey, well, for someone who's had 20 years of experience in investing all sorts of asset classes, all of which have their own unique advantages and disadvantages, you've really nailed your colour to the mast with the launch of your book on crypto trading. What makes you so sure that crypto trading isn't a fad and is here to stay?
Because I understand the technology, really. That's the main reason that I'm as confident about the future success of cryptocurrency as I am. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm confident about the future of any particular cryptocurrency. I'm not one of these people who flies the flag for Bitcoin, for example, and says, yeah, Bitcoin's going to take over the world. It's going to be the currency that we're all using in 20 years' time. I mean, there is a chance that that will be the case. I'm not hugely confident we'll all be using it for buying our coffees, for example, in 20 years' time. But there's a whole world of cryptocurrencies out there that were invented after Bitcoin. Bitcoin was the first, it was the original, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best. There are a lot of very, very clever things going on. And more importantly, some of the cleverest people in the world are working on these projects. And a lot of these projects, actually, which might come as a surprise to people, have absolutely nothing really to do with currency. The word currency in cryptocurrency is somewhat misleading for some of the projects, which are basically just very, very clever software projects.
Well, Bitcoin, as you say, I mean, it was the first one to the scene and is generally viewed, as I understand it, as the gold standard of crypto trading. Do you think this will be superseded in due course?
It's quite possible, yeah. The problem with Bitcoin is it has trouble scaling. In other words, once a lot of people are using it all at the same time to, doing transactions, buying and selling Bitcoins or buying things with Bitcoin, once it gets over a certain level, and we saw that in late 2017 when everybody got really excited, the big Bitcoin boom, and lots of ordinary people were getting in on the act, not just trading type people. And what we saw was that the network started getting clogged up. It started slowing down. It became very slow and very expensive to do any kind of Bitcoin transactions. Now, there are bolt-on solutions to that problem that are being worked on at the moment, and some of them will soon be implemented. Some of them are already being implemented, and they will help to solve the problems, to kind of oil the gears, if you will. But they are still kind of bolt-on solutions as opposed to solutions that come from the very basis of Bitcoin itself and its original code. They're sort of add-ons, which is not ideal. So there are lots of other newer cryptocurrencies that were invented in order to solve those problems. So they're already kind of, they come pre-packaged as solutions without so many problems. Whereas Bitcoin there's a lot of problems and this solution here and that solution there. So I guess what I'm saying is there is every chance that one of these Bitcoin proteges will come and steal the crown from Bitcoin at some point in the future and become a very widely used currency around the world. The problem is it's still too early to know which one is going to succeed yet. And whilst people might look to an expert like me and say, well, you should know which one's going to be successful. The problem is I don't necessarily know which one is going to capture the public imagination. And it's not necessarily the one that's best technically. For example, the reason why I'm saying Bitcoin might actually end up being a successful currency is not because it's got amazing technology compared to any of the others. It's because everyone's heard of it already. So it's got a massive head start in that sense. And So that's why a lot of these other better technology, or in my opinion, better technologies, might have significant problems ever taking the crown from Bitcoin. It's all up to the ordinary people, and I don't know what people are going to think and what they're going to latch onto and what they're going to do.
Well, that's the billion-dollar question. I mean, any new coins have the second mover advantage over Bitcoin, but Bitcoin seemingly has the time advantage in being the incumbent, the first one to the scene. But with all of these coins being launched on what is seemingly a level playing field, is this fragmentation and oversupply of new options merely diluting the opportunity potential for investors, just the same way as like central banks around the world printing new money is devaluing the value of their currency, like the Federal Reserve, for example?
Well, that is a very big issue for Bitcoin at the moment. Bitcoin has in recent times sort of dominated the cryptocurrency industry to a degree even greater than it had done before. So even though the average person in the world is not now talking about Bitcoin all the time like they were back in 2017, it's a little bit out of fashion. Nonetheless, in the crypto space, it's even more dominant. Its market cap is even higher compared to other cryptocurrencies than it was before. Its price is performing better relative to most other cryptocurrencies over the past couple of years. So it's kind of grown in size in that sense. And now that we have the Federal Reserve and other central banks printing endless amounts of money, that's actually added to the upward pressure on Bitcoin's price, because there is a story going round, and it's kind of a fair story, that Bitcoin is a hard currency, as opposed to the dollar and the pound and the euro, which are soft currencies. Why are they soft currencies? Because they can wheel out the money printers and they can print any amount of these currencies that they like, and they are doing exactly that. And whilst that may or may not create consumer inflation, what it does do is put downward pressure on the real value of one or more of those currencies, because there's just huge amounts of it being printed. It's oversupply, supply compared to demand. As I say, sometimes historically that turns up as consumer inflation, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, for example, post 2008, 2009, all of that printed money ended up in the asset markets, inflating housing markets and stock markets all around the world. And that's, they all had higher prices instead. And so that's where all the printed money ended up. Now, the story that's going around this time is that because these currencies are being endlessly printed, and that is not good in the long term for the value of those currencies, so people say, so people think, where do they turn? They turn to currencies that can't be endlessly printed. And the two major ones are gold, obviously, has been for thousands of years considered a stable store of value that people can rely on to just not necessarily rely on to rise in value or to even be stable in value, but they can rely on it not to become worthless, if nothing else. It always keeps a certain amount of its worth, even when it's relatively cheap. Bitcoin obviously is much newer to the scene. It's only existed for a decade or so. But the beauty of Bitcoin is that only 21 million Bitcoins will ever be created. And already about 17 to 18 million of them are already in existence. The next 3 to 4 million will be created over the next 100 years or so. So really, we're just, they're mining a tiny amount of new Bitcoin now compared to the amount that already exists. And so for that reason, it's considered a hard currency like gold. You can't just make infinite amounts of it. And so people are starting to turn to it. Its price has been rising faster than the stock market since the big crash in March. Now, I'm not saying that will necessarily continue. This is a story that has grabbed people's imaginations, and they're buying it, which is one of the reasons why the price is currently going up. But, I still try and, as a trader, I try and always have distance, right? I always try and be dispassionate. I don't buy completely into any story and go, this is inevitable. Bitcoin's price is going to go to $1 million per Bitcoin because it has to, because all these other currencies are being printed endlessly and Bitcoin isn't, and Bitcoin's limited. Yes, that's a good story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to go hell for leather now and buy Bitcoin until its price is $1 million. I just, that there's nothing, what's the word? There's nothing definite. There's nothing what's the word I'm looking for? When something's not definitely going to happen.
If something's not definitely going to happen,
inevitable. I'm looking for the word.
Well, I mean, it's interesting what you say about separating emotions from trading, and certainly everyone's had the story about someone who's either accidentally made a killing or lost a fortune trading Bitcoin. For example, this Florida programmer called Lazio Handek, who talked someone into accepting something like 10,000 Bitcoin he'd mined on his computer in exchange for 2 pizzas. If the recipient still held them, he or she would be a millionaire several times over today. In regard to stories like this, do you think that such meteoric growth potential still exists with Bitcoin, or will the opportunity seekers need to look further afield for this?
No, I mean, there could well be meteoric opportunities for Bitcoin. The Bitcoin $1 million story, because currently, as I speak, the price of Bitcoin is about $9,000 per coin. I do not rule out, it would be crazy to rule out the idea of Bitcoin one day being worth $1 million a coin. I know that sounds crazy because it's now only at 10,000, but considering its historical record of rising thousands and thousands of percentage points and being the best performing asset of the past decade, we can't rule out further rises on that scale. I'm primarily a trend trader. I trade the way that the trends go. I follow the waves of the market. And whilst we're in a downward wave at the moment, we have been for the past couple of years, a long-term downward wave in the price of Bitcoin, though, as I say, there's been a short-term rise in the price recently. Nonetheless, the very long-term trend is, if you look at a sort of a chart of Bitcoin's price over the past decade, it just goes up, vertically. So, what the crash that we had since late 2017 was effectively a blip, if you look at it on that scale. And so we may well return to another bull cycle that takes the price of Bitcoin to $100,000 or $50,000 or even $1 million. And the way that I teach trading, in the Crypto Trader, the way I describe it is I try and capture the long-term trends where possible, but not the ridiculously long-term trend, because when Bitcoin goes through a cycle every few years or so, it rises enormous amounts, but then it tends to fall about 90%, as it did in 2018. So the reason why the publishing firm asked me to write the book in the first place was because they'd seen that I'd done a Facebook post to my followers on at the end of 2017. It was Boxing Day 2017. And I said, look, I'm not a fortune teller. I don't know for sure which way the price Bitcoin's going to go next, or other cryptocurrencies, but I've seen a major warning sign. I've been trading other things, stocks and shares and so on, and futures for 20 years. So I know what to look out for. And I saw various signs that told me we're probably at a major top of the market. And so I warned my followers and I said, I'm now going to be scratching my chin and thinking, should I get out? And I did indeed. I sold my Bitcoin like a few days later. I sold my other cryptocurrencies a few days later and over the next sort of couple of weeks or so. And so I got out very near the top. And that's why the publishing company was impressed enough to give me a publishing deal. And as I say, I try and capture those long-term trends. So ideally, for example, I would have got in and put all my, if I had a crystal ball, I would have put every single penny I had into the market in 2016 when the previous bull run began, and I would have sold it all, as I did, at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. And then I try and sit on my hands as best I can. I have been doing some trading during this bear market because with a really volatile asset like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, even when they're in a bear market, they sometimes quadruple in price. Like Bitcoin quadrupled in price in 2019. It went down to a very low point and then it quadrupled, but then it fell back a long way again. So I've been trading those medium term trends like that. I got in on that quadrupling and then I sold again when I saw it looked like it had reached the top. So my aim as a trader is basically to make money. I'm not going to sit through 90% drawdowns as the price falls 90% through 2018 and 2019 and go, oh, I'm hodling, as they call it in the Bitcoin world, hold on for dear life. I'm not going to sit through that. Well, why should I?
Exactly. Why should you? And I certainly, as someone who doesn't trade Bitcoin, but I have taken a very close look at it, and I saw the way it approached I think $5,000 a coin, and it really didn't hang around for very long. And I think that having been newly converted to cryptocurrencies, as soon as it reaches that magic number again, if indeed it does, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be waiting, because that does represent a very, very valuable, efficient entry point. But many...
So you're waiting for an all-time high?
What, $5,000?
Oh, sorry, $5,000 you said?
Yeah, $5,000.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah,
I see.
Waiting for it to go back there, because it did test that level last month, I think.
Yeah, sorry, I misheard you. I thought I didn't hear you say $5,000. Yes, it did. It tested that in March, but it's risen a lot since then. It's almost doubled since then.
Yes, but
sorry, go on.
The volatility does appeal in terms, like you say, it's risen a lot. It's probably closer towards $10,000 a coin. So if you can make essentially a 100% return on your money from investing at 5,000 and knowing that it will inevitably go up to 10 at some point in a much shorter space of time than you would necessarily in the middle of a bear market like we are, certainly in a panic mode at the moment with equities, then it certainly seems like a good winning prospect.
Out of interest, I mean, I know you're the one asking the questions, not me, but I'm going to ask one quickly. If it never gets back down to 5,000, would you consider buying it at a higher price?
Absolutely, yes. I would. We'll need to see, like you say, the resumption of the trend, shorter-term trend, and continue. But I did notice, with regards to the kind of the mania, panic selling with COVID-19, what was curious was Bitcoin actually did take a hit as well at the same time.
Yes, it did. It was very interesting because, a lot of again, you get all these kind of evangelists for Bitcoin, and they were all saying at the beginning of the market crash, oh, if the market crashes, everybody will run from stocks into Bitcoin. And I just thought that's just such nonsense, because if there's a market panic, people sell anything and everything they can get their hands on. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, I sold all my stocks at the beginning of the stock market crash. Not wanting to blow my own trumpet too much, but I'm on record on...
Why not?
Various, yeah, well, what the hell? I'm on record on another podcast saying sort of weeks in advance this market should be crashing by, because we already knew by January and certainly by February that, this was a serious thing, this pandemic, and that it was not confined to China anymore, and it was going to spread crazily. I mean, that was pretty obvious even in February. And so I was sitting on these podcasts going, why is the market still rising? It still hadn't crashed. So I was ready for a crash, and I took out portfolio insurance, and also I sold all my stocks at the beginning. So it worked out pretty well for me. And I certainly didn't expect that money to go into Bitcoin, the money that people were drawing out of the stock market. And sure enough, it fell almost perfectly in line with the stock market. As the stocks fell, Bitcoin fell. And then as the stocks recovered, Bitcoin started recovering as well. So it became very heavily correlated with the stock market. What's interesting over the past few weeks, so I'm talking about the tail end of April, beginning of May, Bitcoin has started pulling away from the stock market. Even though the stock market is still rising at this point in time, Bitcoin has been rising even faster. And so, again, I'm scratching my chin and thinking, is this the end of the correlation? Is Bitcoin now coming into its own? And that story about how it's a hard currency and people need to move some of their savings into it because the dollar is being devalued by all the money printing. Maybe that is having a serious effect now and pulling Bitcoin up higher than the stock market.
Interesting. I mean, many luminaries have actually said that cryptocurrencies represent a threat to the floating fiat currencies and the established order. And certainly, like we've seen, the US dollar, the value of the US dollar has kind of diminished since 1913, since, weirdly enough, coincidentally, or no coincidence, behind the creation of the Federal Reserve. But given that people are mooting the fact that there is a threat to the established order, why haven't governments banned it?
Because it's not enough of a threat yet. That's unfortunately the answer. And if it were enough of a threat, I'm sorry, but I think they would do everything they could to hamper its development. They can't ban it completely because, of course, it's a decentralized network. It doesn't have any central server that you can just switch off. It exists on the computers of a lot of people who use it. But they could make it very difficult, for example, to transfer your money, your dollars or your pounds into Bitcoin. They could make that extremely difficult if they wanted, because of course our dollars and pounds are stored primarily in the developed world's financial system, which is controlled mainly by America. So really the US banking system is kind of central to everything still. Ironically, of course, Bitcoin was invented to circumvent the US banking system, and yet it kind of is a hostage of it.
Oh, damn it. So I guess swap it into different coins in a potentially more of a closed system. I guess that could be a way of circumventing any future moves by governments to curtail its influence.
Well, I mean, if governments just say we won't let you transfer your fiat currency into any kind of cryptocurrency, then it's going to be really hard. There will still be ways to do it, but it will be so difficult that the average person really wouldn't want to bother with it. So it's hard to see how the whole thing could go mainstream. I mean, look at the problems that Facebook has had with its cryptocurrency Libra. I say cryptocurrency, but they've watered it down now so much that it's you could barely even count it as what would traditionally be called a cryptocurrency. They ever since they announced it, the US lawmakers have been down on them like a ton of bricks, saying you've got to comply with 1,000 regulations before you can even think about launching this currency. So that's the kind of thing that any kind of dollar alternative is up against. The US know they're onto a good thing with the dollar being the world's global reserve currency, the currency that people use for most trade that goes on throughout the world. They've got a good thing and they don't want to give it up. It's kind of obvious they wouldn't, I suppose. Like Donald Trump said in a tweet around the time that Libra was first mooted, he said the dollar will always be the world's global reserve currency.
Oh goodness.
Always.
Forever.
Yeah.
Isn't that what Queen Victoria said about the British Empire? It will last for 1,000 years or something like that.
Yeah, 1,000-year Reich.
But anyway, that hasn't happened as we can tell already. But it's an interesting point about, for example, hyperinflation and inflation that's happening with the soft currencies. And we're seeing that with the devaluation, essentially, of the US dollar as a result of them printing more money. Do you think that cryptocurrencies really are the answer to shielding people away from the kind of ramifications of hyperinflation as fiat currencies, as we saw with the Zimbabwean dollar back in 2008 and others, Weimar Germany in early kind of like 20th century? If that happens again, would you reckon that would be a good store of value for people to flock to?
If it does, then yes. I'm not a great believer in the hyperinflation narrative. I mean, I certainly do think that all this currency printing could create significant inflation, say in the range of 10, 20%. So, that's pretty major inflation. But the kind of hyperinflation we saw in the Weimar Republic and that we saw in Zimbabwe a decade ago it tends to only happen when a society is collapsing, as opposed to just a currency. So it's kind of a symptom of the government having completely lost control over the economy. And it's hard to imagine any of our developed economies or our developed country governments getting to that kind of loss of control. Zimbabwe I was fascinated with it at the time. A decade ago, I started bidding on eBay for $1,000 trillion Zimbabwean dollar banknotes.
Oh yes,
and which I got really cheap. Yeah,
they're actually for sale on eBay now for hundreds of dollars. Those 100 trillion, they are. It's weird. They've actually. The irony is despite being a product of hyperinflation, those people who've got those notes and went through the associated suffering with their country going to the wall, they're actually profiting very handsomely from selling them as monuments to those dark bygone days.
Oh, I wish I'd bought more of them now. I only bought a few.
It's crazy. Imagine playing poker with those kind of sums. Be crazy, wouldn't it? Anyway, I don't want to trivialise it.
But I suppose to answer your question ages ago, the answer is if there were hyperinflation, which I don't think there will be, but if there were, then yeah, Bitcoin and gold are kind of the obvious go-to places, or anything that can't just be made endlessly. I mean, silver, for example, is not such a great currency and does tend to devalue over time because you can actually create quite a lot of it. You can get quite a lot of it out the ground, whereas gold is more scarce. It's much more difficult to ramp up production of gold, and Bitcoin is, its rules are set in stone. You can't create any more than the tiny amount of Bitcoin that's being created. It's a very hard currency in that sense. So yeah, it could well be a store of wealth. If we're ever going to see a Bitcoin worth $1 million, I suspect it would be because hyperinflation had occurred in the developed economies. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about silver. The gold-silver ratio at the moment is the highest it's ever been. I think it's 120 ounces of silver equals 1 ounce of gold, and it's never been this high, I don't think, ever.
Right.
If you're buying silver, obviously it's more accessible to the average investor than gold is at the current time, but if you're to swap that into gold, if the gold-silver ratio falls to, say, 50 or even 70, you've made a very handsome return if you're just swapping into gold, if that falls. That's
true, but yeah, it is a big if, though, because of the greater supply of silver. So, yeah. There is an argument to say that the price of silver will just kind of slowly fall forever and ever and ever, or at least in relation to the price of gold.
Yeah.
So that ratio, it's possible that ratio could never recover. You're clearly, I imagine, from this interview, getting the idea of the kind of trader I am. I'm the kind of trader who never believes in a sure thing.
No, of course.
However strong a story is, even if the gold-silver ratio is at historically high levels, I never necessarily believe that means it's going to return to its average kind of rate. It might just carry on in a crazy direction for an indefinite amount of time. And that might not even be forever. It might be, say, 100 years. Maybe the price of gold will disappear off into the stratosphere compared to the price of silver for 100 years. And then in 100 years' time, it starts working its way back to something more historically normal. But unfortunately, I don't trade on that long-term a basis. I'll be dead by then. So
exactly, nor do I, unfortunately. Wouldn't life be easy if it was that straightforward? But you're absolutely right. Tomorrow isn't even guaranteed, and I think it's always good to always essentially arm yourself for a potential outcome that you might not have bargained for and rationalise as a result of that. So there'll be a number of people, Glenn, who are going to be potentially looking to crypto trade after listening to this podcast. And I did want to ask you what the most frequent mistakes rookie crypto traders tend to make when they first start out, and how newbies, like people listening right now, can avoid them.
Well, the biggest mistake that they will make, and when I say all, I mean nearly everybody, is this hodling thing that I mentioned earlier. The fact that buy and hold has actually become a meme with its own special word, hodl, kind of tells you everything that you need to know about how it's become a kind of religion, or it certainly became a kind of religion in the run-up to the 2018 crash. And even in the post-2018 crash, all these people were holding on to their cryptocurrency holdings, or holding on to their Bitcoin as the price fell by 90%. And bear in mind, a lot of these people have bought at or near the top. So they were losing 90% of their entire investment value. And yet the mantra was hodl, hodl, hodl. Hodl it came originally from an internet chat room a few years ago. Somebody misspelt the word hold when they were talking about holding Bitcoin. They misspelt it hodl, and then somebody realized it was a good acronym for hold on for dear life. So a huge number of memes were spawned by that thing, and they all consoled themselves with it as the value of their investments were falling by 90%. So many people were going, well, I'm a hodler. That's just what I do. I hodl. It's like if I said to you, I've got £1,000 and I'm going to throw some of it away each day until there's only 100 left, because that's what I do. That's my thing. You wouldn't think that was so clever. But when they say, I'm a hodler, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna hold as my money just disappears down the drain. I'm gonna do that because that's my philosophy.
Wow.
I just think It's just silly. So that's what they all do. That's the biggest mistake that they were all making, and that's why I was so frustrated, and I wrote that book when the publishers asked me, because I've been trading for 20 years and making money at it for 20 years, and there's a reason for that. It's because I don't do that hodling thing.
Yeah, you've got longevity, and it's interesting, isn't it? Those people who bought at the very top, around about $20,000 a coin, you kind of can only imagine like how much pain they must be in watching their investments fall by 90%. And like you said,
I know people who lost nearly everything. Lost their houses. I've seen some pretty horrible horror stories. Luckily, all the ones that I know personally have picked themselves up and dusted themselves down and managed to get on with their lives. But, that kind of trauma is not just financially crippling. It's also emotionally crippling. It makes you lose all your self-esteem. It's terrible to go through something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a case in point, really, when you hear these kind of stories. And I know if you don't learn from your own mistakes, then at least you can learn from other people's mistakes as well. That's a smart thing to do.
Yes.
So, Glenn, I know that you're a busy man and we're running out of time. But for those listeners who want to find out more about you, where can they?
On my website, which is just glengoodman.com, or follow me on Twitter at Glen Goodman. What else? Oh, my book is on Amazon, and actually I shouldn't advertise Amazon, should I? It's in all good bookshops, both online and offline as well. In the real world. It's called The Crypto Trader, and yeah, it's got a brief kind of couple of chapters of explanation about how Bitcoin works and how cryptocurrencies work and all that kind of thing. But it's not really like a technological book. It's more a trading book with all of the kind of trading lessons and skills that I've built up over the past 20 or so years. Everything that kind of helps me to be a profitable trader, really.
Great. Well, Glenn, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. So there you go. Glen Goodman, everyone, the crypto trader. Have a great day, Glenn.
It's been great talking to you.